Hello, everybody. I'm talking today with Dr. Bob LaRochelle. Bob has a number of titles with Energion Publications. Probably the most important one for us to think about today, other than the one we're going to talk about, is Crossing the Street, which gives his background growing up as a Catholic and even with theological training as a Roman Catholic, and then moving to mainline Protestantism later in life. We'll ask him to say a few words about that a little bit later, but today we're interested in his book, Is Anybody There? Does Anybody Care? Which may leave everybody wondering exactly what we're talking about. But before I even ask him that, let's go back to the problem. What is it that inspired you to write this? Why do you think that you needed to write? And I think in the way that you'll tell us what the problem is that you're addressing.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much, Henry, for giving me this opportunity. And hello to everybody out there. Basically, the bottom line on this is that I found myself as a pastor getting frustrated with the number of churches that were making a considerable amount of peace with the possibility of closing. Okay, I find that in New England there are a lot of the traditional Protestant churches that are struggling, and I heard this question in my head. Is anybody there? Does anybody care? And I saw that as really applying to some of my own concerns regarding that. So that was really the trigger. It was never my intention. It really wasn't my intention to write a book this year, but then a confluence of issues came to me that got me to think that this would be really relevant. So the more I got into it, the more relevant I felt that it was.
Book writing is an occupational hazard, I guess. So there we go. Okay, so we're looking now. We're looking at particularly at the problem. We're talking about church closures.
Right.
And over the years, people have been talking about this as largely a mainline Protestant and perhaps liberal, although really many moderate churches that are not particularly liberal or conservative fall into that category, that they're losing members, they're getting smaller, and as they get smaller, they need to they're combined churches, or churches simply don't have enough members left in order to make the church successful. But this has recently also been really the experience of large evangelical denominations as well, as I understand it. So what you're saying is you don't want them to be, how shall I say, comfortable with the prospect of their church closing.
Right. I also think there's something underlying this that needs to be addressed as well, and that's a youth problem. What I'm seeing in a lot of mainline churches is, do I want to call it a giving up on youth ministry? Maybe I do. Maybe what I have found myself emphasizing is that there are certain programs that kids are invited to within congregations that may be connected, for example, to making their confirmation. But the overall youth ministry of the congregation really isn't operative, and it really doesn't exist. And I talk about this in the book, from my own past background in youth ministry, which is really where I started with a lot of the ministry that I do. I found a high degree of enthusiasm among kids, but I also found that there was a great need for work among the adults who were working with these kids. And I've seen that kind of peter away, whether it's churches not hiring youth ministers, which is not atypical with a lot of smaller mainline churches, or with churches just deciding they have other things to do. I think to a great extent, kids have been kind of left out there hanging.
Okay, so to some extent, we see a situation where aging members of a church, right, and both you and I stand in that kind of past the minimum retirement age, at least. You, like many pastors I know who have retired, seem about as busy after retirement as before, but that's another occupational hazard.
Right.
But in any case, we see congregations who are essentially becoming comfortable. We're going to age out of existence and we're going to take care of ourselves until it's too late, until, and then the church can go. So you're satisfied with a shrinking church that will age itself out of existence. Have you observed that?
I have observed it to a certain extent, and I say to a certain extent because in talking to a lot of older members of congregations who I either knew through my past work in their churches as a pastor or through traveling around and doing a lot of supply preaching, which I'm doing virtually every Sunday in this area, what I have really heard from them is their sense of the importance of keeping the church alive in the future and doing more for young people. I mean, I think a lot of people, who are, 70 years old or more, and I can cite 70 because that's my age, I'm not really ready to go plunge into involvement in youth ministry per se, but it's very important to them that the church continue. I have had conversations with people in churches where there was a very good chance that closure was going to be examined very closely, and they're really concerned about that. And they're not only thinking about the present moment with themselves, possibly losing the church to go to, but these kids, these younger people who are not having the experiences that they had. Now, I don't expect that youth ministry circa 2023 is the same as youth ministry even circa 1960s when I was involved in it, but I do have a very strong feeling about their very serious intent in that area. Yeah.
Okay, so then we must have a problem that gets between the desire and finding a plan and executing the plan. I say this as somebody, I've sat in a committee room where after about 45 minutes of discussion, I pointed out to everybody in the room that we were talking about getting teens and even 20 somethings into the church, and nobody in the room was under 45.
Right.
And that was when I was somewhat younger than I am now. That would be, I was one of the ones that was over 45, but not as old as I am now. And the sense that I had in that room was everybody, you mentioned a very important point. Youth ministry in 2023 doesn't need to be the same as youth ministry in 1960. Right. One of the senses I had in that room was that a lot of people, and I don't mean they were intentionally going off the rails or something, but they were thinking entirely about solutions that they saw in youth ministry when they were young.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which would have been youth ministry in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And, that time has come. So how do we get past the, I guess there's a lack of connection with the current youth that you need to serve, but you have a desire, but you don't know how to get in and do fulfill that desire.
Yeah. Well, I touch upon this in the book, but what I'd like to do is just give an example of what I was touching upon here, okay? One of the things that used to be the case with respect to youth ministry and congregations is that they were the youth ministry was very congregation-based. You'd have X number of kids who would be connected somehow to their church youth group. Such is not really the case anymore. So I think one has to broaden the horizon. And the example that I would use which is what I talk about in the book, is something that would have happened if COVID hadn't hit. In the community where I was the pastor, we had several churches of different denominations, and realizing as the pastor of my own church that I wasn't going to get an active youth night just with the kids from that particular church, I, along with some other people, went out of our way to connect with different churches in the area. And we're talking churches of different denominations. Unfortunately, what happened is, as time went on, so did COVID, and we weren't able. We had organized what would have been a really great youth night with discussions for kids, with good music, with good food. There's always going to be pizza at these things, okay? And we had made that arrangement. We had adults in our church who were really excited about just coming to that youth night and serving some food and talking to some of these kids. Then COVID hit. Okay. So it's very easy to blame COVID for virtually everything nowadays. But my point here is that in a COVID-free kind of setting, what I think churches need to do is connect with each other. I think in the mainline churches that I know, the old days of centering everything on your local church youth group ain't going to make it. But there has to be a willingness within the leadership of a congregation, whether that be the pastor or a youth minister or a volunteer, or whatever the case may be. There has to be a real willingness to go outside of the box. I really believe that. The times they are.
I want to give you a few minutes here before we're done with this to talk about something other than youth ministry, although it seems to me like youth ministry does have to be a very central point if you're wanting a church to survive. The question I would have for you again that still deals with youth ministry is to what extent and how do you work to involve youth in church leadership?
As much as possible, service. Okay, service. Getting kids inspired by a cause. Okay, whether it be the local food bank or I've had situations in the past with churches that I've served where the young people were involved in sponsoring a concert for the victims in Flint, Michigan, and some other issues that have come up around New England, around the state of Connecticut, where there was a real need. So I think one of the things that is a concern in many churches, of course, is money, right? And there were a couple of occasions where I raised some concern among some of the members of my congregation because I was really emphasizing things like concerts, activities in the church that were not going to make any money for the church. And, the kids were involved in a lot of that leadership. So I feel that going outside of the box and getting kids engaged in things that would be of interest to them, I think is really important. I also want to say, before I end on this part, that my experience with kids over the years, with young people over the years, has been you can really find that they get very excited when they're thinking about service to others. I've seen some absolutely amazing things, whether it's kids working with the Salvation Army on weekends, whether it's kids, helping with needs of homelessness, involved in homelessness and their local community. And so there's so many different examples. The Flint water crisis at that time really just drew a lot of interest among the kids who I was working with when I was pastor of that particular church. So, that would be my overall read on that.
Okay, so let's move away from specifically youth ministry to ask first, why are you so concerned about church closures? Let me give you just a background from what I've heard a lot of people say about church, is if we have to close one local church, we then bring more members into another church nearby, and we end up with the same amount of ministry taking place, and we're spending less money on the buildings. So why are you so deeply concerned about church closures?
Because I think that the local church has very strong elements and should have very strong elements of community. And if I were to look at, I'll look at a church that I used to serve years ago, which just closed a few months ago, a few years after I was there. And what I think of when I look back on that church is a very vibrant, active community that church happened to be the only church of that particular denomination in that town, and now that's missing. Okay, that's very much missing. The activity within that was really a very strong part of that church. That's all gone from that town, and so is the church. So, I do understand that there are some situations, depending upon the communities, size of the communities, and all that, where a local church merging with another local church does make sense. I'm not saying that every church closure is wrong, or it shouldn't be considered or anything like that. But what really gets my goat is when you're in some relatively small towns, such as we are here, and I'm from New England, okay? And what I'm seeing is the very strong possibility of the one church in that town of this particular denomination is about ready to close. I find that to be very problematic and unnecessary.
Okay, now you come from mainline, perhaps one might say either a liberal or a progressive background. You have some critiques of more conservative movements, which you're welcome to comment on, but I'm particularly wanting to ask you about one aspect of liberal progressive churches as perceived by people who are in other branches of, which is shall we say, an opposition to ideas, well, the words like evangelism or mission obviously or tend to become devalued. And so in some cases there's some resistance, shall we say, to bringing in new members into the church. Would you comment on that?
Well, first of all,
and the view in general.
Well, I don't think that there's anything wrong with the terms evangelism and mission. I think that people of a more liberal persuasion, such as I, can be very comfortable with that. Okay, I mean, evangelism is, getting out the gospel. I mean, that's what we're all about. Mission is involving service. So that's all well and good. It's nothing to be really rattled about. What I think is, to me, what becomes more problematic is some of the fundamentalist tendencies that are there. The affirmation that it's only in Christianity, it's only in following Jesus that one can achieve eternal salvation. Those are the kinds of things that I find more problematic. But the idea of being evangelistic or missionary, I think those are good.
Okay, now does that have an impact on the loss of membership and the church closures in mainline, especially progressive denominations?
What in particular?
I'm talking about, there's the great debate often in the broad Christian community, including, from conservative all the way across, is right. Why are more liberal, more progressive church or denominations losing members? Now that question has lost some of its bite as more conservative churches begin losing members.
Right.
So then I regularly see people debating, why are these churches losing members? And depending on the perspective of the speaker, very often it will be the young people don't want to go there because the experience is, quotes, not authentic. And that's stated in different ways, but that comes from either side on what's going on. So I was just wondering how you thought the theological position of the church impacts the likelihood of these, or the process of church closures or losses of membership.
I think there's been about a 20 or 30 year period in which perceptions of churches have changed from within those congregations themselves. All right. I mean, I think that, if I'm looking at, liberal Protestantism, so to speak, I know that there would be a fair amount of people who were in that particular Protestant denomination, in that particular Protestant church, for their entire lives, and were fairly conservative. Okay, they had a more conservative approach to theology, and sometimes to some of the political issues involved within our society, and how the church addresses those. I think somewhere along the line, going back again 20 or 30 years ago, it's that middle-aged group now. I mean, people who are now in their 50s or 60s, whose parents were really active in sending their kids to church, getting their kids to church, getting their kids to confirmation class or baptism class, or whatever the case may be. And a lot of that has faded away. I mean, I think a lot of people who are around my age really started, fading away from churches 20, 30 years ago. I mean, I saw a lot of that happening as I was raising my own children. And when I look back upon my own childhood and my own youth, the activity of adults within congregations was far different. So I think it's a plethora of stuff. But I mean, clearly in mainline churches, there has been a serious gap that has occurred, and I think that if one such as I were to believe that these churches are important and need to have vitality moving into the future, we kind of have to change the way that we do things. And that includes some of the things that I suggest in the book, and includes some of the things that I mentioned right here. We can't do things right now the way that we did in the 60s and the 70s. That just can't be done.
Yeah, I mentioned in the introduction your book, Crossing the Street,
Yep.
Which tells about the story of, how you moved from a Roman Catholic church to mainline Protestantism, and in ministry, all the way through. How did this impact your understanding of this whole problem?
Wow. You mean the movement?
The short version, not the book length version.
When I was a Roman Catholic and struggling with Roman Catholicism, I found myself very excited about what I saw in Protestant congregations that I visited. And as you know, from being the editor of Crossing the Street, both the original and the second edition, I do some anecdotal things about that. And I was excited by what I saw happening in these Protestant churches. And I was comparing that to what I was experiencing within my own Catholic tradition in local parishes, which was not always as outstanding. And what I find is I've become troubled over time with the fact that a lot of things that were really meaningful within Protestant congregations, whether they be liberal, or if you just want to call them mainline, whatever we want to say about them, those have faded away. When I look back at the Protestant churches that I visited when I was trying to figure out what the heck I was going to do with my religious life here in terms of denomination, I was excited about the quality of adult education programs, the quality of Bible studies, what was happening for the youth, okay, about mission trips, all that kind of really good stuff that I saw as really integral to mainline Protestantism. And then over time, as I've gotten into more of a knowledge of some of these local Protestant churches, I've seen some fading away that I feel, uncomfortable with, to be honest with you. And it's one of the reasons why I ended up writing this book. I really never intended to write another book this soon, but I really never did. But a lot of things started going through my mind. A lot of things that I experienced kind of led me in that direction.
Yeah, I think pastors just have a problem retiring. That's all. Okay, let's finish up with this.
Okay.
What is the impact that you hope reading and studying your book might have on pastors and churches?
in the ideal world, what I would say is, I'm not promising you, whoever's listening to this, or any pastors or churches, the answer to everything. But the impact I'd like to see is try a few things that I mentioned in the book. Try a few things that I mentioned regarding how you work with your church council, regarding how you work with youth, and even beyond that, how you work with other congregations in your community, how you connect with other congregations in your community. What are you doing to improve your adult education? What are you doing to improve your youth ministry? If you're saying, well, we don't have enough kids, we don't have enough people who would want to come, how about stepping out and, if you're the local UCC church, and in that same town there's a Methodist church and an Episcopal church and a Roman Catholic church too, how about making some connection with them and seeing what you can do together with your kids, seeing what you can do together as an evening program with adults? Okay, I really, as much as I advocate for not closing churches, what I also try to stress in this book is the importance of churches and communities and areas connecting with other churches. And I would even say, as a liberal Christian, honestly, if you can make any connection with some more conservative churches who are, really willing to be open to some conversation, do it. That's really important. Back when I was a youth minister years ago, youth minister in the Catholic Church, we had an evening program where our kids were sharing time and discussion with kids from a very conservative church, and it went well. I mean, really, really did go well, and we saw a lot of commonality in there, despite some of the differences. So,
okay.
All right.
Well, everybody, the book is Anybody There? Does Anybody Care? And in a moment here, for those of you who are viewing, we'll have both a link and a QR code. So if you have your phone out with your camera pointed at the TV screen and get the QR code, and you can be taken directly to the book page. And for more author information on Dr. Bob LaRochelle, who is the author of this and a number of other books that we publish here at Energion, plus a couple that are published elsewhere. So I'll have information on that on the screen for you. Bob, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
And obviously, as your publisher, I join you in hoping for good book sales.
Thank you, Henry.